The morning sun peeked through the curtains as Maya's alarm buzzed for the third time. She groaned, finally pulling herself out of bed. Being the daughter of the city's first black police chief meant she had inherited his habit of triple-checking everything, including her alarm settings. "Maya, breakfast is ready," her mom called from downstairs. The smell of fresh waffles filled the air, making Maya's stomach rumble. She quickly tied her curly hair into a neat bun, straightened her navy blue school blazer, and grabbed her brand new backpack, a beautiful designer piece she'd received for her 16th birthday just last week. In the kitchen, her dad sat at the table, still in his police uniform from his night shift. Dark circles under his eyes couldn't hide the pride in his face as he watched Maya enter. "There's my honor roll student," he said warmly, sliding a plate of waffles toward her. Their morning routine was sacred. Even after long nights at work, he always made sure to have breakfast with his daughter. "Dad, you should get some sleep," Maya said, drizzling maple syrup over her waffles. "I know you had that big case last night." He waved off her concern with a gentle smile. "Nothing's more important than our breakfast talks. Besides, your mom's waffles are worth staying awake for." He winked at his wife, who playfully rolled her eyes while refilling his coffee cup. As Maya ate, she scrolled through her phone, checking the morning's study group messages. Her friends were meeting at the Corner Cup Cafe before school to review for their chemistry test. The cafe had become their favorite spot, close enough to school but far enough to feel like their own special place. "Oh, speaking of the cafe," her mom chimed in, packing Maya's lunch. "Don't forget your gift card is in the small pocket of your new backpack. And please get me my usual vanilla latte." She slipped an extra $5 into Maya's hand with a conspiratorial smile. Maya loved these quiet morning moments with her parents. Her dad might be the chief of police, commanding respect across the city, but at home, he was just her goofy father who told terrible dad jokes and always burned the toast. Her mom, a high school counselor, balanced them both with her warmth and wisdom. Standing up to clear her plate, Maya caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. The designer backpack matched perfectly with her school uniform, a detail that made her smile. It was more than just a beautiful bag. It represented her parents' hard work and their celebration of her academic achievements. "Got everything?" her dad asked, going through their daily checklist. "Phone? Keys? ID?" "Check, check, and check," Maya replied, patting her pockets. "And before you ask, yes, I charged my phone last night, and yes, I have the pepper spray you insisted on in the side pocket of my bag." Her father's expression softened. "I know you think I'm overprotective, but the world isn't always kind," Maya finished his sentence. "I know, Dad, you've taught me well." She hugged him tight, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with coffee. Her mom joined their hug, squeezing them both. "My two favorite people in the world," she said, kissing Maya's forehead. "Now get going, or you'll be late for your study group." Maya adjusted her backpack straps and headed for the door. The morning air was crisp, holding the promise of a beautiful spring day. As she walked toward the cafe, she thought about how lucky she was. Sure, being the police chief's daughter came with its pressures. Everyone in town seemed to know who she was, and she felt the constant need to set a good example. But she was proud of her father's work in the community, proud of how he was changing things from the inside. Little did she know, her ordinary Thursday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The designer backpack bouncing against her shoulder would soon be at the center of a story that would shake their community and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and what it means to protect and serve. The Corner Cup Cafe buzzed with its usual morning energy. Steam hissed from the espresso machine as baristas called out drink orders, and the smell of freshly baked muffins filled the air. Maya pushed open the heavy glass door, the little bell above it announcing her arrival. Her study group had already claimed their usual corner spot, textbooks spread across the wooden table. "Hey, we saved you a seat," her friend Liv waved, pushing a chair out with her foot. "And I already ordered your usual iced chai." Maya set her designer backpack down beside her chair and pulled out her chemistry notes. The morning light streaming through the cafe's big windows made the bag's silver hardware sparkle. She barely opened her notebook when she noticed a police officer she'd never seen before watching her from near the counter. Officer Wilson was having a bad morning. New to the city's police force, he was still adjusting to the faster pace and higher crime rates compared to his small hometown. 3 overnight burglary reports sat unresolved on his desk, all involving stolen luxury items. The sight of a teenage girl with an expensive designer bag in this part of town immediately caught his attention. He watched as Maya laughed with her friends, his suspicion growing with each passing minute. The bag looked too expensive, too new. In his mind, it didn't fit. Without bothering to notice her school uniform or how comfortably she fit into the cafe's regular morning crowd, he made his decision. Maya was explaining a chemical formula to her friends when a shadow fell across their table. She looked up to find Officer Wilson standing over them, his hand resting on his belt. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying across the now quieting cafe. "I need to see some identification and check that bag." Maya's friends fell silent. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. She felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady, just like her father had taught her. "May I ask why, officer?" "There's been a string of robberies in the area," he replied, reaching for the backpack. "Designer items being stolen. That bag matches the description." Maya's hand instinctively moved to protect her bag. "Sir, this was a birthday gift from my parents. I have the receipt in my wallet." "Step away from the bag," Officer Wilson interrupted, his voice growing harder. "If everything's legitimate, you have nothing to worry about." The cafe had gone completely silent. Maya could feel everyone watching, could see phones being raised to record what was happening. Her face burned with humiliation, but she remembered her father's lessons about staying calm in tense situations. "Officer," she said clearly, "I know my rights. You need probable cause to search my belongings, and having a nice bag isn't probable cause. I'd like to call my father." Before she could finish, Officer Wilson grabbed the backpack, yanking it away from her grasp. The force of his pull knocked over Maya's chai, sending the cold drink spilling across the table and onto her uniform. "Hey, you can't do that." Liv stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Other customers began to murmur, some standing up, others moving closer. The cafe manager approached cautiously. "Officer, that young lady is a regular here." "There must be some mistake." "Stay back," Officer Wilson commanded, already unzipping the bag. "This is police business." Maya watched as he roughly pulled out her books, her wallet, her carefully organized notes. Each item tossed onto the wet table made her stomach clench tighter. She could have told him who her father was, could have played that card immediately. But something in her refused to do it. This wasn't right, and it wouldn't be right even if she weren't the chief's daughter. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking slightly but her voice remaining clear. "I'm recording this, officer. I'd like your badge number and your supervisor's contact information." Officer Wilson faltered for a moment, finally looking, really looking, at the teenage girl in front of him. He saw her school uniform, now stained with chai. He saw her friends, a diverse group of students with their advanced chemistry books. He saw the growing crowd of concerned onlookers, their phones raised, their faces showing a mix of anger and disappointment. But it was too late to back down gracefully. As he continued his search, Maya's school ID slipped from a pocket, clattering onto the floor. A regular customer who worked at City Hall bent to pick it up, his eyes widening as he read the name. The next words spoken would change everything in that cafe, and they would ripple out to change much more in the days to come. "That's Chief Thompson's daughter." The words hung in the air of the Corner Cup Cafe like suspended dust in sunlight. Officer Wilson's hands froze on Maya's school ID, his face shifting from authority to uncertainty in an instant. Time seemed to slow down. The morning crowd had grown larger as regular customers delayed their departures, standing witness to the unfolding scene. The hum of whispered conversations mixed with the soft peeping of phones recording everything. The strong smell of spilled chai tea still filled the air, a reminder of how quickly things had escalated. Maya stood tall, her school uniform stained but her dignity intact. She could feel her phone shaking slightly in her hand as she continued recording, just as her father had always advised. "Now that you know who I am," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the silent cafe, "would you like to call my father yourself, or should I?" Officer Wilson's confidence crumbled visibly. He looked down at the scattered contents of Maya's backpack. textbooks, notebooks, a perfectly legal pepper spray keychain her father had given her, and the cafe gift card her mother had mentioned at breakfast. Everything spoke of a normal teenager's life, not the criminal activity he'd assumed. I need to verify, he stammered, reaching for his radio. His hands were trembling now, matching the tremor in his voice. The cafe manager stepped forward again, this time more boldly. "Officer, I've known Maya since she was in middle school. She and her friends study here almost every morning. This is completely unacceptable." Liv had already started gathering Maya's belongings, carefully wiping chai tea from her friends' notebooks. Other customers offered napkins, tissues, and words of support. An elderly woman who always sat by the window reading her morning paper approached Maya with her cardigan. "Dear, you're shaking. Put this on. You can return it tomorrow." Maya accepted the cardigan with a grateful smile, wrapping it around her shoulders. The simple act of kindness made her eyes water, but she blinked back the tears. This wasn't the time to cry. She needed to handle the situation the way her parents had taught her, with strength, dignity, and purpose. "Everyone, please keep recording," she addressed the crowd calmly. "But step back and give the officer space. This situation is uncomfortable enough." Even in the midst of being wronged, she showed the leadership qualities that made her father so proud. The cafe's morning playlist continued to play softly in the background, an oddly cheerful soundtrack to the tense scene. A Taylor Swift song about staying strong played as Officer Wilson finally got through to his supervisor on the radio. His words came out jumbled, but the message was clear enough. He had made a massive mistake. Maya's phone buzzed with incoming messages. News traveled fast in their community, and her friends from school were already sharing the video clips. But Maya didn't check the messages. Instead, she focused on gathering her dignity along with her belongings. "Officer Wilson," she said, reading his nameplate. "I'd like to formally request a copy of the incident report. I believe you're required to file one when you conduct a search, especially one without probable cause." Her voice remained steady, using the knowledge she'd gained from years of dinner-table conversations about proper police procedure. The other customers watched in admiration as this teenage girl handled herself with more professionalism than the officer who had profiled her. Some were already calling the police station directly, asking to speak to the chief. Others were posting their videos online, where the story would soon spread like wildfire. Liv stood protectively next to Maya, helping her repack her bag. "Your dad is going to flip when he sees this," she whispered. Maya shook her head slightly. "My dad's going to handle this exactly the way he handles everything, by the book, with integrity, and as a teaching moment." She straightened her blazer, now mostly dry, but still bearing the chai stains. "That's why he's such a good chief." Officer Wilson's supervisor's voice crackled over the radio, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't move, don't say anything else. The chief is being notified and is en route." The cafe fell into an expectant hush. Maya checked her watch. Her chemistry test would start in 30 minutes, but somehow that didn't seem very important anymore. This morning had become about something much bigger than a test. It had become about standing up to prejudice, about maintaining dignity in the face of discrimination, and about showing that true authority comes from character, not from a badge. As they waited for the chief to arrive, Maya thought about how this incident would affect not just her and Officer Wilson, but the entire community. Her father had always said that change happens one interaction at a time, one lesson at a time. This morning was about to become one of those defining moments that turns a bad situation into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The police chief's arrival was announced first by the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the cafe windows. Everyone inside held their breath as heavy footsteps approached the door. The little bell chimed, but this time it seemed to ring with authority. Chief Thompson entered wearing his full uniform, his face a mask of professional calm that only his daughter could see through. His eyes swept the scene quickly. Maya in her stained uniform wearing a borrowed cardigan, Officer Wilson standing awkwardly by the counter, phone still recording everything, and his daughter's belongings scattered across a wet table. The cafe fell so quiet you could hear the coffee machines humming. Officer Wilson straightened his posture, his face pale. "Chief, I can explain." The chief held up his hand, silencing him. He walked to Maya first, his steps measured and deliberate. "Are you all right? he asked softly, his voice carrying in the silence. I'm fine, Dad, Maya replied, standing tall. Just a ruined uniform and some wet notes. The chief nodded, then turned to address the room. I understand many of you have recorded this incident. I want to thank you for documenting what happened here. Please keep those videos. The department will need them for our investigation. He paused, making eye contact with several customers. What happened here today isn't just about my daughter. It's about every young person who's ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. I'm here now not just as Maya's father, but as your police chief who needs to address a serious issue in our department. Turning to Officer Wilson, his voice remained professional but carried an edge that made everyone listen closer. Officer, please read out the probable cause that led to this search. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Sir, I received reports of stolen designer items in the area, and when you saw a young black girl with a nice bag, you assumed it was stolen, the chief finished for him. Tell me, did you check the bags of any other customers today? The silence that followed was deafening. A barista behind the counter accidentally dropped a spoon, making everyone jump. No, sir, Officer Wilson admitted. The chief nodded slowly. I see. And did you follow proper procedure for conducting a search? Did you call for backup? Did you file the necessary paperwork before approaching a minor? Each question seemed to make Officer Wilson shrink smaller. No, sir. Hand me your badge and gun, the chief ordered quietly. You're suspended pending a full investigation. As Officer Wilson complied, his hands shaking, the chief addressed the cafe again. To everyone here today, I want to apologize. This isn't what our police force stands for. This isn't what our community stands for. And while I'm horrified this happened to my daughter, I'm even more concerned about all the times this might have happened to someone else's child who didn't have a police chief for a parent. Maya stepped forward, placing her hand on her father's arm. Dad, can I say something? The chief's professional mask softened as he looked at his daughter. He nodded. Officer Wilson, Maya said, her voice clear and strong, I want you to know that I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, it wasn't, but because holding on to anger won't fix anything. Instead, I hope you'll learn from this. I hope you'll think twice before making assumptions about anyone based on how they look. The cafe erupted in soft murmurs. Someone started clapping, and soon others joined in. Maya's words had transformed a moment of shame into an opportunity for growth. The chief pulled out his phone. I'm calling your mother to bring you a clean uniform. Then I'd like you to come down to the station to file a formal complaint. Not because you're my daughter, but because every citizen has the right to report misconduct. He turned to Officer Wilson one last time. You'll report to my office at 9 a.m. tomorrow. We're going to have a long discussion about bias, proper procedure, and what it means to truly protect and serve our community. As Maya's mother arrived with a fresh uniform, the crowd in the cafe began to disperse. The morning's events would soon spread across social media, becoming a catalyst for important conversations about prejudice, power, and progress. But in that moment in the Corner Cup Cafe, a father and daughter had shown everyone what real leadership looks like, facing injustice with dignity, strength, and a commitment to making things better for everyone. The police station buzzed with unusual energy that afternoon. News of the morning's incident had spread quickly, and every officer felt the weight of what had happened. The chief's office door remained closed as he sat at his desk, reviewing the security footage from the cafe for the third time. On his computer screen, dozens of emails poured in from community members. Some shared their own similar experiences, while others expressed support for his handling of the situation. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since morning, with local news stations requesting comments and city officials wanting updates. A gentle knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Come in, he called out, already knowing who it was. His wife and daughter entered, Maya now wearing a clean uniform. The statement is ready, his wife said, placing a folder on his desk. As the school district's head counselor, she understood both the personal and professional implications of what had happened. Maya helped write it. The chief looked at his daughter with pride. Despite everything that had happened that morning, she'd still gone to school, taken her chemistry test, and then come straight to the station to file her official complaint. Now she stood in his office, somehow looking older than she had at breakfast. Before you read it, Maya said, sitting down across from her father's desk. I want to talk about Officer Wilson. Her parents exchanged glances. The chief leaned forward, giving her his full attention. Go ahead. I've been thinking, Maya continued, her voice thoughtful. What happened this morning was wrong, but maybe we can turn it into something good. What if, instead of just suspending him, we made this a learning opportunity for the whole department? The chief sat back in his chair, considering her words. What do you have in mind? Well, Maya pulled out her phone. I've been reading the messages people sent me today. So many kids from school shared similar stories about being judged or stopped for no reason. But they were too scared to report it. What if we created a program where young people could share their experiences with officers? Not to shame anyone, but to help them understand how their actions affect us. Her mother smiled softly. You want to build bridges instead of walls? Exactly, Maya nodded. Officer Wilson was wrong, but punishing him won't fix the real problem. We need to change how officers see young people, especially young people of color. The chief stood up and walked to his office window, looking out at the city he'd sworn to protect. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street below, where people went about their daily lives, each carrying their own stories and experiences. You know, he said finally, when I became chief, I promised to make this department better. But sometimes it takes something personal to show us where we're really failing. He turned back to his family. Maya, would you be willing to speak at our next department training session? Maya straightened in her chair. You mean tell my story? Not just your story, her mother added, catching on to the idea. We could invite other young people too. Create a real dialogue. The chief nodded. Officer Wilson's actions today were unacceptable, but they're also a symptom of a bigger problem. Maybe it's time we addressed that problem head-on. He picked up the folder with the statement and began to read it aloud. Today, an incident occurred that highlighted the ongoing challenge of bias in law enforcement. As both the chief of police and the father of the young woman involved, I am taking immediate action to address not just this single incident, but the systemic issues it represents. Maya listened to her father read, watching his face as he came to the parts she had written herself. She saw how his expression changed at her words about forgiveness and change, about using this moment to make things better instead of bitter. A text message buzzed on her phone. It was Liv asking how she was doing. Maya smiled, typing back quickly, making changes, real ones. The chief finished reading and looked up at his daughter. This is really good, Maya. But are you sure you want to take this on? It won't be easy. Some people won't want to hear what you have to say. Maya thought about the morning's events, the humiliation, the anger, but also the support from strangers and the opportunity she now had to make a difference. Dad, she said with a small smile, you always tell me that real change happens when brave people speak up. Well, I'm ready to be brave. Her mother wiped a tear from her eye, trying to hide it. The chief walked around his desk and hugged his daughter tightly. In that moment, they weren't the police chief and the girl from the incident at the cafe. They were just a father and daughter, working together to make their community better. Outside the office, the station continued its daily operations, but something had shifted. Tomorrow, changes would begin. New policies would be written, new training programs developed. And it all started because a young girl refused to let an injustice pass quietly by. 2 weeks after the incident at Corner Cup Cafe, the police department's largest training room was packed. Officers filled every seat, with some standing along the walls. At the front of the room, Maya adjusted the microphone, her heart pounding but her voice steady. Most of you know why we're here today, she began, looking across the sea of uniforms. 2 weeks ago, I was just a girl getting coffee before school. But what happened that morning showed us all that we need to do better. In the back of the room, Officer Wilson sat quietly. He'd spent the past 2 weeks on desk duty, completing intensive bias training and meeting with community leaders. The shame of that morning had transformed into something else, a determination to learn and change. Maya clicked to her first slide, showing security footage from the cafe. This could have gone very differently, she continued. If I wasn't the chief's daughter, if people hadn't been recording, if I hadn't known my rights, this story might have had a very different ending. Her father stood at the back of the room, watching with pride as his daughter commanded the attention of his entire department. Next to him, his wife squeezed his hand, both of them knowing this was just the beginning. But today isn't about that morning, Maya said, clicking to the next slide. It's about all the other mornings, all the other young people who've faced similar situations. Today, you're going to hear their stories too. One by one, other teenagers came forward. A boy who was stopped while riding his bike in his own neighborhood. A girl questioned for shopping at an expensive store. Each story was different, but they all shared the same thread of assumptions and bias. The officers listened. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing their own past actions in these stories. Others took notes, asking thoughtful questions about how they could do better. During a break, Officer Wilson approached Maya by the water cooler. "I've been wanting to tell you something," he said, his voice quiet. "That morning, I thought I was doing my job, but I was really just acting on my own prejudices. I'm sorry." Maya handed him a water bottle. "The hardest part of making mistakes is learning from them," she replied. "What matters is what you do next." Back in the training room, the chief took the podium. "Starting today, we're implementing new department-wide policies," he announced. "Every officer will complete enhanced bias training. We're establishing a youth advisory council to maintain ongoing dialogue with our community's young people. And we're creating clear guidelines for probable cause that will be reviewed quarterly." He paused, looking at his officers. "But policies are just words on paper unless we commit to real change. Each of you chose this profession to protect and serve. Today, we're learning how to do that better." The afternoon session focused on practical scenarios. Officers and teenagers worked together, role-playing different situations and discussing better approaches. The energy in the room had shifted from tension to collaboration. Maya watched as Officer Wilson participated in a scenario with a young boy who'd shared a story about being stopped while walking home from basketball practice. The officer's approach was completely different now, respectful, patient, and aware. During the final exercise, officers wrote letters to their future selves describing the kind of law enforcement professionals they wanted to become. The room fell quiet except for the sound of pens on paper and occasional thoughtful sighs. "Remember," Maya said as the session came to a close, "every interaction you have with a young person shapes how they see law enforcement. You have the power to build trust or break it. Choose wisely." As the officers filed out, many stopped to thank Maya and the other teens who'd shared their stories. Some shared their own children's experiences, now seeing them in a new light. Others asked about joining the Youth Advisory Council. The chief's wife, who'd been quietly observing all day, hugged her daughter. "You've started something important here," she whispered. Looking around the empty training room later, Maya saw the notes officers had left behind: commitments to change, questions about doing better, and plans for building bridges with the community. On one desk, she found a note from Officer Wilson: "Thank you for turning my mistake into a lesson that will help others." Her father appeared in the doorway. "Ready to go home? Your mom's thinking pizza tonight." Maya gathered her presentation materials, feeling both tired and energized. "Dad," she said as they walked to the car, "do you think we really made a difference today?" The chief looked at his daughter, seeing not just his little girl, but a leader who'd helped his department face some hard truths. "Change doesn't happen in one day," he said, "but days like this, they're how it starts." 6 months had passed since that morning at Corner Cup Cafe. The familiar bell chimed as Maya pushed open the door, breathing in the comforting smell of coffee and fresh pastries. This time she wasn't alone. The cafe was hosting the first community breakfast between local teens and police officers. Round tables filled the space where her confrontation with Officer Wilson had happened. Now, officers and teenagers sat together, sharing stories over coffee and muffins. The changing leaves outside the windows painted the scene in warm autumn colors. "Maya," called the cafe owner, hurrying over with a tray of hot chocolate. "Your usual table is ready. The reporters will be here in 10 minutes." The local newspaper was covering the success of the Youth Advisory Council Maya had helped create. In 6 months, they'd made real changes. New training programs, community outreach events, and most importantly, a sharp decline in complaints about bias incidents. Officer Wilson, now back on regular duty, sat at a table with 3 high school students, listening intently as they shared their experiences. He caught Maya's eye and smiled, a genuine smile that showed how far he'd come from that tense morning half a year ago. "You know," he said as Maya joined their table. "I almost quit the force after what happened. The shame was overwhelming. But then I realized running away wouldn't fix anything." One of the students, a freshman boy, leaned forward. "What changed your mind?" Officer Wilson glanced at Maya. "Someone wise taught me that mistakes are only failures if you don't learn from them. Now I train other officers about bias awareness. I share my story as a warning and a lesson." The local news crew arrived, setting up their cameras near the counter. Maya's parents entered shortly after, her mother carrying a stack of papers and her father still in uniform from his morning meetings. "Ready for your interview?" her mother asked, straightening Maya's collar. "Remember, just speak from your heart like always." Maya nodded, watching the scene around her. At one table, an officer was showing teens how to properly document any interactions with police. At another, students were teaching officers about their social media campaigns for community awareness. The reporter, a kind-faced woman with a notebook, sat down across from Maya. "So, tell me how this all started," she said, pressing record on her device. Maya took a deep breath. "It started with a backpack," she began, "but it became about so much more. It became about changing how we see each other." She explained how the Youth Advisory Council now met monthly, how they'd created an app for reporting and tracking police interactions, and how local schools had started hosting regular dialogues with law enforcement. "The most important change," Maya continued, "isn't in the policies or programs. It's in the conversations happening around tables like these. It's in officers learning to question their assumptions and young people feeling confident enough to speak up." Her father joined them, adding his perspective as chief. "What happened to Maya was wrong," he said, "but her response to it showed us all a better way forward. She chose to build bridges instead of walls." The reporter looked around the cafe. "And Officer Wilson, how has his involvement impacted the program?" "He's become one of our strongest advocates for change," Maya explained. "He visits schools now, sharing his story and teaching other officers about the importance of checking their biases." As if on cue, Officer Wilson stood up at his table, laughing at something one of the students had said. The tension that had once defined him was gone, replaced by genuine engagement with the community he served. The morning sun streamed through the cafe windows, catching the silver hardware on Maya's backpack, the same one from that fateful day. She kept it as a reminder, not of the hurt, but of the change it inspired. "Sometimes," Maya told the reporter, "the worst moments can lead to the best changes. We just have to be brave enough to make them happen." After the interview, Maya joined her friends, who were teaching a rookie officer about their experiences. The cafe buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the sound of barriers breaking down. Her mother appeared with fresh cookies, setting them on the table. "You know what I love most about these meetings?" she said, watching the scene. "Everyone's just talking, really talking." Maya smiled, reaching for a cookie. 6 months ago, she'd stood in this same spot, feeling scared and angry. Now she watched as officers and teens shared stories, swapped phone numbers, and planned future events. The cafe owner rang the bell behind the counter, not the doorbell, but the one they used for announcements. "I'd like to make this official," she called out. "Every first Saturday will be Community Bridge Breakfast. Coffee's on the house." Cheers and applause filled the cafe. Maya caught Officer Wilson's eye again, and they shared a knowing look. Sometimes the worst moments really did lead to the best changes. All it took was the courage to learn, the wisdom to listen, and the strength to transform pain into progress.